man, we're gonna talk about worms. Like, there's a lot to it.
Whoa! Look at that chunk.
Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. My name is Bradley Hallman. If it's your first time here, guys, please bump that like, think about subscribing. We put a lot of hard work and different ideas into creating content for this channel and making this thing grow. I'm sitting here, you know, it is wintertime, and but for a lot of anglers like myself, a lot of regional anglers, a lot of guys really start looking at some of their first tournaments that are planned for the year, and I can't tell you how many times that ends up being Florida, whether you're in the Southeastern Division, or even if you live up north, a lot of guys will go down to Florida and fish BFLs and things like that, you know, just to kind of get out of the snow, get out of the cold weather, go somewhere where it's a little bit warmer and really try to enjoy catching some fish that you know are further along than our fish are up here, even if we're talking about South Texas. What I was thinking about was I was thinking about some of the baits and tackles that I use whenever I go to Florida every year, like where it started, where we were back in the beginning to where we are now, and the types of worms that we're using and how we're using them differently. We're going to talk about what worms that we're throwing. We're going to talk about where to throw them, and we're going to talk about the speed and retrieve at which we throw them. So these are three really big things. We can really get you guys dialed in on the worm. Hey guys, welcome to the Bass Cave. Today, we're talking about worms. Lots and lots of worms. These things are a really powerful tool. We're going to go over all different sizes, shapes, colors, what's the most effective, where to throw them, how to throw them, and how to retrieve them and how to rig them. So we're going to cover everything there is to cover on this worm. I want to start with this video that's really from the very first tournament of last year down in Florida to show you the strength of this worm, dude. This thing catches monsters. It's a tournament winning bait, late winter, early spring. It's a powerhouse.
Oh my God, I got her. Oh, don't you come off there. Come here, come here, come here. That's how you start the BASS Open right there. Whoa, look at that chunk. Way to start the day, baby.
All right, guys, that fish catch that you saw right there, that came on one of those big swim worms. That is a bait that I've been using for many years in Florida, along with everybody else down there. There's been some design changes and things that are different, and that's kind of some of the things that I wanted to go through. In the very beginning of this thing, it probably just started with a worm, right? Guys were just throwing regular straight tail worms, something that probably resembled more like a trick worm, something like that. As things and times evolved, the original tail action that probably came from was a worm like this, which is just a paddle tail worm. And then guys started taking scissors and cutting this tail. Probably one got cut on accident or something, and they got to see that action that tail had once this was cut into that V shape, which actually led into the speed vibe worm. Some of the other baits that have come along that we have changed, so we started with the speed vibe worm. Actually, it was the paddle tail, right? We had the paddle tail first, and then we went to the speed vibe, and then the speed vibe went to the Magnum speed vibe, which is what you see a lot. And now Big Bite has come out with a new tour swim worm. So same thing, it's got the same tail action as the vibe worm does. It's got the vibe tail, but then it's got rings down the sides of it, and this thing is a 7-8 inch long worm too. So it's a long worm, longer in the same size as the Mag Trick, a little bit longer than the Mag Speed worm. Where this thing changed and where I saw it change is we went back to Florida, and I don't remember what year this was, but there had been an FLW tour event on Toho the week before we got there. It was won on this worm. And then we were there for an Elite Series event. This is somewhere around 2009, 2010. Same thing, our event was won and dominated with this worm as well. The thing that was interesting about this time of year, this event when we went a little later in the spring, and the fish were primarily post-spawn. And these things still dominated around vertical cover, whether it was lily pad stems or docks, but it was anything that was vertical, and those fish were post spawn. And here was the big difference. What we were doing with this bait at that time is everyone was swimming it. Had it up in the water column, just winding it. It's something that is not talked about a whole lot, but winding these worms can be extremely, extremely powerful in the deep south in Florida, all throughout the spring season. So it's something that I use in my arsenal. You know, it's literally, you just throw it out there, it hits, and you just start winding. And you just wind slow, you know, and that tail's kicking. The tail does its job as it comes through the water. So this is a question I get all the time about the stick bait. Is it better to be rigged wacky style or Texas rigged? I will say that probably you get more bites with a wacky rig, okay? When we're talking about a weightless stick bait, the wacky rig probably gets more bites. It's a little bit more cantankerous to mess with because it gets hung up in the grass and catches grass and things like that, but it probably gets more bites. I really like to throw mine Texas style. I really do. It's weedless. It comes through the cover a little bit better. It keeps the bait clean so that whenever you come up over one of those humps of grass into one of those holes, if I was throwing it wacky style and it caught a little piece of grass and came in and fell, then it tends to get hung up. Also, you can throw, you know, these style of baits of worms, the ones that don't have any action to them at all, they're a really good wacky worm as well. It doesn't have to be a stick bait, especially if you get more into some finesse presentation, heavier pressure, where you feel like they've seen a lot of stick baits. A lot of times one of these little worms will shine and show up a little bit better than a stick bait will, just because the fish have been pressured and seen so much more. And this is a really good bait you can throw on a spinning rod. I know a spinning rod in Florida sounds a little bit funny, but I've watched a lot of guys that are hammers pound them every single day with a spinning rod and light line, throwing the wacky down in Florida. So it's a big player as well. But like I say, when I'm power fishing down there, I really do like these swimming worm style worms. I'm really excited to throw this new one. This is a brand new worm actually from Big Bite. It's called the Swim Tour worm. It's the long worm. It's the size of a Magnum trick worm. It's got a bit larger profile. It's got the kicking tail. It's got some rings up at the top to give a little water distribution. As I'm bringing it through the water, I'm excited to try to swim this as well as casting it around and throwing on the bottom. So this was a new bait that just came out last year. I did not have them in my arsenal, and it's going to be a bait that the fish in Florida hadn't seen. So you guys know how it is. Anytime you can get a bait that the fish haven't seen yet, a lot of times you can really up your odds and have a special week. If we kind of go through the progression here, like I say, I'm going to have it rigged on either an 1/8 up to a 1/4, but guys, I'm not throwing a 1/4 unless it's extremely windy. 3/16 is what I prefer. I don't care if I'm throwing the 8-inch or smaller. If I'm throwing the stick style, I'm trying to throw it weightless if at all possible. If I'm fishing it in 6, 7, 8 foot deep, you know, at that point, yes, you've got to put some weight on it to get it down. But before that, if anything, if it's 4 foot and less, guaranteed I'm going to try to throw it weightless. So we can't forget about the Cinco style worms, you know, the stick baits. We started with this one right here, and then we've kind of progressed through time, and a lot of guys were throwing a little bit bigger one. You know, this is a 7-inch here, and then this is a fat stick by Big Bite. So it's closer to the same length as the original, but yet it's much thicker. So all these things give us a different look and a different shape. But these stick style baits are generally fished weightless or with a very, very light weight. Matter of fact, all these worms are generally fished with a very, very light weight. It's usually not very heavy weight. Same thing, throwing around the same types of cover, but these are usually just thrown and left to sit still. So the Florida fish tend to be very, they like the really, really slow fall, the real natural action, and that's where these baits really, really shine, and they tend to shine a lot in the deep south in the early spring. I would say primarily the way that I like to throw them is, number one, I want to go slow. Like, it's not about moving and covering a lot of water unless I'm swimming the worm. So we'll get to the swimming worm in a minute. But if I've just got a weight on it and I'm firing it out there and letting it sink, I'm looking for lily pads. I'm looking for dock pilings. I'm looking for holes in hydrilla, shell beds. It can be used on offshore shell beds. It can be used shallow. I'm looking for anything that is different in the grass. It could be mother's tongue, which is another type of vegetation that lives down there. Mother's tongue tends to grow a little bit shallower than a lot of the other vegetations, which turns out to be a really good spawning habitat if the lakes are high enough and not too low. There's all different kinds of vegetation down there. The ones that anything that stands out that is different, something that has a hole in it, if we're talking about hydrilla, if it has holes in it, it can be a player. We were down on the Harris chain one year in Florida, and it was later in the spawn, and we caught them really well on the stick baits. And primarily a lot of the top 10, that's what they were doing, but they were actually out in the hydrilla. And if you looked at the boats, it looked like they were offshore. But what was happening was those fish were spawning. It was a little later in the spawn, and the water was warmer down deeper, and those fish were spawning in 8-9 foot of water. The water was really, really clear. And if you got down there in those little holes of those grass beds where there was a little bit of rock, a little bit of gravel, a little bit of shell, something that was a hard bottom, and then you got your stick bait in there, and you could just sit and shake it. And a lot of those bites were big, big fish. So. All right, the hooks and stuff that I like to use for my worms. This hook right here I call Dad's hook. This is actually a 5/0 Gamakatsu offset round bend. It's a hook that I got away from, right? Like I threw it as a kid. You know, True Turn made this hook, I think, originally, probably. I'm just guessing. It was a hook style that I threw and caught a lot of fish on. And then the EWG style hooks came out, you know, years later. And EWG stands for extra wide gap. And you can see that it's a much bigger round bend on it. And I started throwing this style hook, and I kind of got on the EWG for a long time. And I got one of some plastic bites where I started missing some fish where I was getting bit but wasn't able to get a hook in them. And I went back to Dad's hook, the round bend, the offset round bend, and I had a lot of success with it. So I would say that 90% of the time that I'm Texas rigging a worm, this is the hook that I use, the offset round bend. And like I say, I use it anywhere from 5/0 down to 3/0. It depends on the size of the worm that I'm throwing. 5/0 for the bigger worm. I may even throw this thing in a 6/0. But this is definitely the hook that I'm throwing most of the time. I throw the EWG style still if I'm using bigger, fatter, like the Fat Stick by Big Bite, something that's got a larger profile around in size. Then that's when I throw the EWG style. But most of the time I'm going to throw this offset round bend. All right, let's talk about the line. The line that I'm going to use down there in the size. I'm probably going to primarily use Sunline Shooter. Shooter's a little bit more abrasive resistant than the Sniper. It's something I use a little bit more anytime I'm dragging something, slackline hook set. This is the line that I generally use. I'm going to use it, this is 22. That's a little bit stout, but I'm going to start at 16. So I would say 16 to 20 is kind of my parameter. Depending on how heavy the cover is, I could go up to 20, possibly even 22, but 16 is going to be kind of my starting point. I feel like that fluorocarbon is plenty. I don't want braid straight down to a worm there. I don't care for that. Some of you guys that like to do the braid leaders and stuff, that's great. Give that a try. I don't see any problem with that if you've got a lot of faith in your knot. So for me, it's straight fluorocarbon and it's shooter. Now let's talk about rods. So I just told you that I was throwing fluorocarbon. So the line that I'm using makes a big difference in the rod choice that I'm going to throw. You guys know that I'm a big fan of the Falcon Amistad. That rod's going to be a little bit light just for the simple fact that we're talking about fishing around vegetation. And it's not that I'm trying to cut the vegetation, it's that the fish have the tendency to get around or be, you know, around that vegetation when you get a bite, and grass gives real easy. Whereas if I was in Oklahoma or somewhere that's just a rock hole, I've either got a hard dock or a hard rock or something like that that doesn't give, right? So the Amistad, throwing the exact same bait would be my choice, but for down in Florida or anywhere around vegetation, it's going to be the Amistad extra heavy. It's just a little bit stiffer. It's just one power higher on the rod combo. So Falcon Amistad extra heavy for me, guys. That's going to be my worm Texas rig go-to. All right, guys, that's pretty much my rundown of worms. Make sure you get all different shapes, sizes, colors. Works throughout all of the spawn, pre-spawn, post-spawn, during the spawn, everything down in the deep south. The worm is a powerful, powerful tool. I hope this video helped you guys out. I really appreciate y'all being here. Don't forget to bump that like, hit the subscribe, and as always, until next time, I'm out of here.